So welcome to the overdue RNG video. I mean, this is going to be an informative video. Don't expect this to be entertaining. I'm going to try to rush through everything because this mechanic is completely obsolete in the next version anyway. So hopefully you will get some information out of this video. It's not going to be one of those majorly interesting videos to watch, but it's going to be informative. Let's get on with the basics. I'm going to try to explain why RNG exists and how it works. So this is like a general world. People just create a world, and usually most people use a seed. And obviously, if you use a seed, then you're going to generate a world with a specific shape that is always coming out the same. Make sure to have structures on, otherwise this doesn't RNG doesn't work. And then you create your world. And the first thing you obviously get is an identical world if you create a seed. So this is the seed 1. It always looks the same. I mean, unless you're going to play on a different version than this one. This is version 12.0, and every single time this world is generated the exact same way, almost the same way. There is like flowers sometimes different, but this particular tree, for example, is always going to generate here and these coordinates. If you're standing on these coordinates, that tree is there. When people are talking about cracking the RNG and it's being completely unintended, it's actually not unintended, it's completely intended. The whole world is generated based on a specific seed, and if the seed isn't generated the exact same way, if you load this world again, then these shapes will be completely different. This mountain hill over here will be completely different from every single time you generate the same seed. So that makes it completely obsolete. You can't share your seed with your friends and expect them to get the same seed, same outcome, the shape of the world and everything. So RNG is actually a big part of seed mechanics. So unless you want to remove that part of the game out of, so we can't share our seeds, you need to have RNG be deterministic. That's the basic understanding of how RNG works. I'll try to go into the depths and just explain what happens behind the hood. And to do that, we need to look at the code a little bit. Okay, so this is Minecraft code. I know that it is a little bit intimidating. I'm not going to show too much code. I'm just going to make it a little bit simpler to visualize when I'm talking about the random sequence. In the code, there is something called rand, and this object is the party responsible for all randomized events in the world of Minecraft. There are some parts of the code that doesn't use this rand. It uses some other random that is part of some other code. But anything that is based on rand, this object right here, is basically crackable because of the way that Mojang coded structures. And we will get to that a little bit later. But this object is the thing that is in question here. It exists in world, and everything that is based on the world is generated based on a specific random outcome, structures and everything based on random outcomes. And this object is responsible for that. Okay, here's a bit more code. I'm just going to show it quick for those that aren't interested in looking at code, but it's kind of easier to visualize it when you have something in front of you. This is the line that actually is responsible for setting the world seed to a specific value. And it's really important to understand this part to why the setting of the world is like set to a specific value. And it's because the structures need to generate in the same location. Otherwise you will get random structures as we just discussed before. And the world seed is basically set to a specific value. The one that we just discussed. The world seed that we just saw, rand here. So the mansions set the world's seed to a fixed value. The reason that the world random is fixed is because it's used later, just a couple of lines down, to set the location of the structure, obviously. But it also fixes this world seed to a specific value. And that's fine when you're generating the world. But something else happens in a different part of the code, and it's the reason that this particular bug have existed in the code for a decade without anyone noticing it. And it's the recreate structures code. This code is responsible for recreating structures every single time a specific chunk is loaded. It doesn't just generate the mansion structures, it actually generates all structures in the game. all the structures that are mine shafts, villages, strongholds, everything. And the last structure it generates is the mansion structure that we just saw. And that's when the world seed is set for the last time. Okay, enough babbling over code. Let me show you my pro paint skills here. So this is like an area with 16 by 16 squares. They're supposed to represent a chunk each, and each chunk have 16 by 16 blocks. Scratch that, I made it bigger. So this is an area that is 80 by 80. Okay, I'm lying, it's 64 by 64, but I got sick and tired of making squares. So each and every single one of these squares represents like a chunk. This is what a chunk looks like. It's a square. In each square there is 16 blocks in this direction and the other direction. Everyone is aware what a chunk is. Anyways, so one of these squares is a chunk, and the world is basically ongoing forever. To understand what mansion regions are, is an area that is divided in the world. Let's say that this area here, let me just make a square here, this area over here is 80 by 80 big. Obviously it's not if you count every single square, but let's just pretend. So this side is 80 by 80 big, and the world keeps on going forever in that direction with more chunks. But this area over here is also subdivided in 80 by 80. So I drew in our picture here, you can just imagine the world goes on forever, 80 by 80. It goes on. So, and then the game generates one mansion in this area over here, one mansion in here, one here, and one here. Maybe it's located here, and this one it's all located over here, and maybe it's located over here. And it's always the same in every single world. And to generate these mansions, the world needs to set the seed in a specific way. Otherwise, you won't get the same outcome every single time, as we've spoken before. I'm going to try and explain this for the, 20th time. This area is filled with chunks, as we discussed. And if there is a specific chunk in this area, let's say this chunk over here, doesn't matter which one you choose, every single chunk in this area will basically load and have set the random value to a specific value. This one will set the random value to, let's say, 54. This one will set it to 54. This one will set it to 54. If you go to outside of this mansion region and go to the neighboring one, if you set this one, it will give you a specific value, but it's not going to match with this one. It's going to give you, let's say, 32. This one will give you also 32, and this one will give you 32, and so on and so on. If you go down below, this one will set it to a different one from this one and this one, yeah, and so on. Just a quick recap for anyone that just fell asleep, in case there was a lot of theory. Every time chunk, like the one I'm standing inside of, is loaded, the world is recreating the structures based on the code that we saw here. The world seed is basically set to a specific value, and the value is based on the chunk, specific chunk that is loaded. If it's belonging to this mansion region, it's setting to a specific value. If it's a chunk within this area, it's setting it to different value, and so on. And now it's come to the point where I need to explain how randomizing works after you have set the seed. You've probably seen this explanation many times before because other people have made a video on this particular topic, but I'll just go through it quickly. World random is called rand, and when we load a structure, we give it a value. Let's just give it a random value here. And then when you request a random number from the rand, you want a randomized number from it, you request it. That's what rand is there for. It gives you random numbers. When you request it, you do it like this, next int, and then you sometimes put a number in here. But it's trivial what that number is. It gives you 6, 2, 3, 5, and so on and so on. If we call it again, it gives you a different number. But it's if you just keep doing it, it just gives you different numbers. Then later in the code, we give rand the same seed as above here. We give it the same number. Then the outcome of the next int will basically give you the first number, and we call it the second time. It gives you the second number. The third time is the third. Fourth is the fourth, and so on. So if you reset the seed, it will pretty much give you a deterministic outcome. So you could pretty much know what the fourth next int is going to be. It's going to be 4112. And in the code, it looks like this. We set the seed here, and then we say random next int. And this is the same thing as what we just saw here in the paint. Then it spits out some number. And we use this number to later in the code. So this is the fundamental understanding of what random cracking is all about. When you set the world rand to a specific value, we just saw how you can do that. You can do that by loading a chunk, and then a specific next int is called in one part of the code, and then it's then goes to a different part of the code, and it calls a number of next ints. And at some point down the line, after a bunch of code has run, and everything is run in a specific deterministic way. It first does one part of the code, and it does the second part, and then it goes on. And at some point, when we need to use the randomizer, for example, we want to determine if a mob should spawn in a specific spot. We know exactly how many next int has been used. So when we are in the part of the code where we need to use the specific random number, we know what the outcome of it is. Let's say that between the setting of the random and using the getting the next int out is, let's say, 127 next int calls, or maybe it's more or maybe it's less, but it's a specific fixed number of next int calls. If this chain of events is exactly 127 next int calls, we will know exactly what the next number is going to be. If it's unknown how many next int calls are between setting the seed and getting to this getting to the outcome of the number, if it is unknown, if this number is unknown, then we can't predict the outcome. But if we know exactly how many it is, then we can predict the outcome. And that's what seed cracking is about, random cracking is about, RNG manipulation is about. To know how many times have you called next int in the code. Now, I wasn't exactly clear about how the exact parts of the game code works. When we, for example, flick a lever, tons of stuff is happening. It happens very quickly, and you first activate some dropper and then some piston and so on. But what you actually don't see is the stuff that is happening in between lines. And before this dropper is activating, even if it's like lightning fast, there is a ton of stuff that is happening in between those lines of code, as we just saw. And those lines of code that you saw happens in between every single game tick. So it's not exactly a matter of ticks. We're talking about down between the lines, in between the ticks. And that's how accurate it is. It's not exactly a game tick later. A game tick later is tons of stuff that has happened in the game code before you reach that. For example, in this part, when you reach this particular hopper. When we're talking about to control the random events, we need to talk about stuff that is down between the ticks. So this is the part of the code that you can just visualize to understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the different phases of the code. So this is the main world loop, and the game runs in a loop. Everything is happening in a specific loop. The updates of everything that is happening in the game happens in a loop. And the first thing that the word game controls is player actions. It checks the player actions. Then it does the weather, and then it does the redstone, and then it does random stuff like lightning and random block updates, village mechanics, and lastly it's hoppers. And this loop runs constantly in the background and updates everything in the game. In the game code, the first things happens first. First the player updates happen, then the weather updates happen, and there is no skipping steps. The second step is always going to happen. Even if you turn off weather, the game will check if the weather is able to set. But because you have turned it off, it will still check it, but it won't do anything with it. Then the mob spawning and the redstone and so on and so on. So just to clarify, as a quick recap, the game runs on a game loop and everything happens within this game loop. Updates of players and talentees, everything, redstone. And the order of the updates is based on this list. The first thing happens first and the second thing and so on. And it's a loop so that this after the 7th step it goes back to 1. And RNG manipulation is all about setting the world seed when a chunk loads, and controlling the number of next ints that has been called, so that when you have reached the part of the code that the next time you call the random number to request a number, you will get the optimal number from the rand. So the optimal number is basically going to use to set the optimal weather. Either you want to make the weather longer or shorter, basically the optimal. Now that was the fundamentals of RNG manipulation. For each of those sections, for example, the player, the weather, the redstone, and so on, is an entire topic on its own, and their manipulation is kind of complicated, so there needs to be probably a video on each topic. But generally, I can go through the different topics quite quick to just explain at least one of them. The most fundamental is the player, and the player actions. For example, if you cross a chunk, you load a new chunk, for example, and that's one way to, for example, load chunks or manipulate the RNG by setting the seed. You can also control the player actions by, for example, mining a block. If you mine a block, for example, a leaf block, there is a chance for this leaf block to drop a sapling, and you can, for example, control if that sapling can drop this seed or not. And that's part of the player manipulation. And if you want to, for example, control the other parts, for example, the weather or the redstone and so on, you have to use redstone to load chunks. You can obviously not use weather to load chunks, so what you can do is manipulate the weather instead. So the player can, for example, in the correct timing, cross a chunk, load the chunk, and at the same time as the game is requesting a random number from the weather from the world to set the weather will be set by the preferred number. You could control the chunk loading much easier by using hoppers or redstone. Obviously, players are a little bit unpredictable because you might not be able to cross this border in just in the right nick of time, just when the weather is need to be reset, because we're talking about sub-tick accuracy. Now there are other parts of this explanation that I haven't gone through. For example, if you load a repeater, flick a lever to make the repeater load the chunk, that's a redstone action. If the player activates a lever, that's a player loading action. And if the hopper is facing into the chunk, neighboring chunk, that's a hopper that loads the neighboring chunk. So these three are all different ways to load the chunks, or basically reset the seed. These are the different parts, and the player can also walk, of course, across the chunk, and these are the ways to control the setting of the seed. The same way you can also set control the outcome of the different parts of the game. For example, the hopper is a part of the tile entity phase. So that if you load a chunk to tick before the player mines a block, you can always get the sapling to drop. Now this video is long enough as it is. I'm not going to go through the mob spawning algorithm or the lightning, the weather, and there are other stuff that can be manipulated using our RNG, but you can get the gist of how the other parts work. I'm going to go through the other topics a little bit more in detail because, for example, the mob spawning algorithm is so complicated to put in a single video. There is hash maps involved, and the order of chunks are also complicated, and there's other stuff that manipulates the random outcomes of mob spawning. And you can just understand that it's much, much deeper, and I couldn't probably put it in this video, otherwise this video would have been probably over an hour long. I will try to make another video on other topics, but for now, this will have to do, I hope. Good night.